The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the Chateau Beaumont ballroom, and in that crystalline moment, Geneviève Laurent's world fractured with it. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her as Bastien Moreau, the man she'd loved for 7 years, stood before her with his hand wrapped around another woman's waist. His voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "Did you honestly think I would choose you, Geneviève? You, with your bookshop and your quiet little life. I need a woman who matches my ambition, not someone who hides behind dusty pages pretending the world doesn't exist." Before we continue with Genevieve's story of transformation and the alpha who would bring Bastien to his knees, I need you to do something for me. Tap that subscribe button right now. Not later. Not after the story. Right now. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about rejection, power, and the kind of love that doesn't beg. And tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. Drop it in the comments. Now let's watch Bastien's world collapse. The aftermath of that moment played in slow motion in Genevieve's mind even as her body moved on autopilot. She'd worn her grandmother's pearls that night, the ones passed down through 4 generations of Laurent women, each one stronger than the last. Her mother had warned her that Bastien wasn't worthy of their legacy, but Geneviève had been blind to everything except the fantasy she'd constructed around him. She left the ballroom with her head high, her spine straight, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that belied the earthquake happening inside her chest. Behind her, the whispers erupted like wildfire. The Moreau family was old money, powerful, connected to every major business venture in Paris and beyond. Bastien's father, Theodore Moreau, controlled half the luxury hotels in Europe. His mother, Celeste, sat on the boards of 3 multinational corporations. And Bastien himself had built a reputation as the golden son, the inevitable heir, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. The woman whose waist he'd claimed was Vivienne Dubois, daughter of a tech billionaire, educated at Oxford, sophisticated in all the ways Geneviève supposedly wasn't. Perfect, in other words. Perfect for a man who measured worth in social capital and business connections. What Bastien didn't know, what no one in that ballroom knew, was that Geneviève Laurent had been playing small her entire life, not because she lacked ambition, but because she'd been taught that safety lived in invisibility. Her bookshop, Lumière de Meuse, wasn't just a quaint little store. It was a carefully curated sanctuary that attracted writers, artists, philosophers, and the kind of people who changed the world from the margins rather than the center. But that night, as she drove through the rain-slick streets of Paris back to her apartment in the Marais, Geneviève made a decision that would alter the trajectory of not just her life, but Bastien's as well. She would stop hiding. 3 days later, she received an invitation that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The envelope was cream-colored heavy stock, sealed with actual wax, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of old-world elegance meeting new-world power. Inside, a single card with embossed lettering. Mademoiselle Laurent, your presence is requested at the Belrose Literary Foundation Gala. Your work in preserving and promoting emerging voices has not gone unnoticed. We would be honored by your attendance. Raphael Belrose. Raphael Belrose. Even the name carried weight. He was a legend in publishing circles, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd discovered and launched the careers of 3 Nobel Prize winners, who moved through the highest echelons of society with the kind of ease that came from genuine confidence rather than inherited privilege. He was also notoriously private, rarely appearing at public events, preferring to let his work speak for itself. And he knew her name. Geneviève stared at the invitation for a long moment, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. The gala was in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to decide if she would step into a world that had always felt closed to her, or retreat back into the safety of her carefully controlled existence. She thought of Bastien's words. Hiding behind dusty pages. Quiet little life. She thought of her grandmother, Marguerite Laurent, who'd survived the war by outsmarting Nazis, who'd rebuilt her life from ashes and refused to bow to anyone. She accepted the invitation. The night of the Belrose Gala, Geneviève stood before her mirror and barely recognized herself. She'd enlisted the help of her friend Celestine, a stylist who worked with celebrities and understood the power of presentation. The dress was midnight blue silk that moved like water, cut to emphasize her natural grace rather than compensate for perceived flaws. Her dark hair was swept up in a way that showcased the elegant line of her neck. The pearls were there too, but now they looked less like a security blanket and more like armor. "You look like someone who could buy the entire ballroom and everyone in it," Celestine said, standing back to admire her work. "More importantly, you look like someone who wouldn't, because you have better things to do with your power." The gala was held at the Belrose estate just outside Paris, a property that had once belonged to French nobility and now served as the headquarters for the foundation. As Genevieve's car wound up the tree-lined drive, she could see lights blazing from every window of the chateau, could hear music floating on the evening air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she'd learned something in the days since Bastien's rejection. Fear and excitement were often indistinguishable, and both could fuel transformation. She entered alone, which felt both terrifying and powerful. No date to hide behind, no armor except her own presence. The receiving line was short. Raphael Belrose clearly wasn't interested in ceremony, but when she reached him, something shifted in the air. He was taller than she'd expected, with silver threading through dark hair, eyes that seemed to see more than they should, and hands that bore the scars of someone who'd worked with those hands before he'd earned the right to delegate. He wasn't classically handsome like Bastien, but there was something magnetic about him, a gravitational pull that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with presence. "Mademoiselle Laurent," he said, and his voice was like good whiskey, smooth with an underlying burn. "I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time." "Have you?" She was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Your bookshop has become something of a legend in certain circles. You have an eye for talent that most publishers would kill for. You recommended Amélie Fontaine's work to one of my editors 2 years ago. She won the Prix Goncourt last month." Geneviève remembered Amélie, a young woman who'd wandered into her shop looking lost, carrying a manuscript she was afraid to show anyone. Geneviève had read it in one sitting and immediately thought of Belrose's foundation. "I simply recognized something that was already there," Geneviève said. "That's the rarest gift of all." Raphael smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Most people only see what they're looking for. You see what's actually there. Would you do me the honor of speaking with me later this evening? I have a proposition that might interest you." Before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Geneviève turned, and her blood ran cold. Bastien Moreau stood in the doorway with Vivian on his arm, and the expression on his face when he saw Geneviève was one she'd never seen before. Confusion. And something that might have been regret, if she'd been charitable enough to name it that. But she wasn't feeling charitable. Raphael followed her gaze, and when he looked back at her, there was understanding in his eyes. "Ah," he said quietly. "The fool from the Chateau Beaumont incident. I heard about that." "You heard. I make it my business to know about people who interest me, Mademoiselle Laurent. And you've interested me for quite some time. The question is, would you like to show Monsieur Moreau exactly what he threw away, or would you prefer to simply move forward as though he never existed?" Geneviève considered this. Revenge was tempting, but it was also a chain that bound you to the past. Yet there was something to be said for justice, for allowing natural consequences to unfold. "I'd like to move forward," she said finally. "But I won't pretend he doesn't exist. That would give him too much power." "Wise answer." Raphael offered his arm. "Then allow me to introduce you to some people who will change your life, and we'll let Monsieur Moreau watch from whatever distance he chooses." What followed was a masterclass in social dynamics that Geneviève had never experienced before. Raphael moved through the room like water finding its path, and everywhere he went, people leaned in, listened, engaged with genuine interest rather than social obligation. And he kept Geneviève at his side, not as an ornament or an accessory, but as an equal participant in conversations that ranged from literature to philosophy to the future of independent publishing. She met Emmanuel Rousseau, who ran the most prestigious literary agency in Europe. She spoke with Laurent Beaumont, whose family owned the chateau where Bastien had humiliated her, and who apologized profusely for what had happened on his property. She was introduced to Sandrine Mercier, a venture capitalist who'd made her fortune backing women-owned businesses and was looking for her next investment. And through it all, she could feel Bastien's eyes on her from across the room. Not constantly, but in those stolen glances that revealed more than sustained attention ever could. He was watching her shine in a context he'd never imagined she could occupy, and the realization of his miscalculation was written all over his face. Vivian, to her credit, seemed completely unaware of the undercurrent. She was lovely and charming and perfectly pleasant, which somehow made everything worse. She wasn't a villain. She was just a woman who'd found herself in the orbit of a man who didn't know what he wanted. 2 hours into the evening, Raphael guided Geneviève onto a terrace that overlooked gardens illuminated by carefully placed lights. The sound of the party faded to a pleasant hum behind them. "You've been gracious all evening," he said, "but I suspect you're exhausted from performing. Am I right?" Geneviève laughed, surprised by his perception. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's paying attention. Most people see what they expect to see. They expect you to be comfortable here now, so that's what they see. I see someone who's learning to be comfortable, which is entirely different and far more interesting." "And what else do you see?" He turned to face her fully, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "I see someone who's spent her entire life being told she's not enough, when the truth is she's always been more than enough. She just needed to be seen by someone who had eyes to see." It wasn't a romantic declaration. Not exactly, but it landed in Genevieve's chest with the weight of recognition. This was what had been missing with Bastien. He'd looked at her and seen a reflection of his own limited imagination. Raphael looked at her and saw her. "You mentioned a proposition," she said, because the moment was becoming too heavy, too significant, and she needed to ground it in something concrete. "I did." He leaned against the terrace railing, completely relaxed. "My foundation is expanding. We're creating a new division focused on discovering and developing emerging voices in literature. We need someone to lead it, someone with an eye for talent, an understanding of the business, and the courage to take risks on artists who don't fit conventional molds. Someone exactly like you." Genevieve's mind raced. "I have a bookshop, which you could keep or expand or transform into something even more significant. This isn't an either-or proposition, Geneviève. I'm not asking you to give up who you are. I'm asking you to become more fully who you are, with resources and support you've never had before." "Why me?" "Because you have the rarest combination of qualities: exceptional taste, genuine empathy, business acumen, and you haven't been corrupted by the industry yet. You still love literature for its own sake, not as a commodity. That's invaluable, and it's exactly what we need." Before Geneviève could respond, the terrace doors opened and Bastien stepped through. His timing was either incredibly unfortunate or deliberately calculated. Geneviève suspected the latter. "Geneviève," he said, his voice tight with some emotion she couldn't quite name. "I need to speak with you." Raphael raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing Geneviève to make her own choice. She appreciated that more than he could know. "I'm in the middle of a conversation, Bastien. It's important. So is this." He flinched at that, as though her simple assertion of priorities was somehow a blow. "Please. Just 5 minutes." Geneviève looked at Raphael, who gave a slight nod. "I'll be inside when you're ready to continue our discussion. Take your time." When they were alone, Bastien moved closer, and Geneviève realized with some surprise that she felt nothing. No flutter of attraction, no echo of longing, no residual pain. He was just a man she used to know, a man who'd revealed himself to be smaller than she'd imagined. "You look incredible," he said. "Different. I'm the same person I've always been. You're just seeing me clearly for the first time." "Geneviève, I made a mistake. What I said at the chateau, how I said it. I was cruel and I'm sorry." "You were honest. I appreciate that, actually. Better to know where we stood." "But that's just it. I didn't know where we stood. I thought I knew what I wanted, who I needed, and I was wrong. Seeing you here tonight, seeing you with Belrose, the way everyone responds to you. You're jealous, Geneviève said, and it wasn't a question. You're seeing me receive the kind of attention and respect you thought was exclusively yours, and it's making you reconsider your calculations. That's not fair. It's completely fair, Bastien. You didn't reject me because we were incompatible. You rejected me because you thought I was beneath you, that I couldn't add to your status or advance your ambitions. And now that you're seeing evidence to the contrary, you want to renegotiate. His jaw clenched. So what, you're with Belrose now? That was fast. I'm not with anyone. I'm finally with myself, which is where I should have been all along. And Raphael, Monsieur Belrose, has shown me more respect in 3 hours than you showed me in 7 years. He's twice your age. And you're showing your true colors again. Age isn't what bothers you. Power does. You can't stand that someone you dismissed has caught the attention of someone you admire, someone whose approval you probably crave. This isn't about me at all, Bastien. Never was. It's about your ego. She turned to leave, but his hand caught her wrist. Not hard, not threatening, but enough to stop her. What if I said I want you back? What if I ended things with Vivian? Geneviève looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Then I'd say you haven't learned anything. You'd still be treating relationships as transactions, women as interchangeable pieces you can move around to optimize your position. And I deserve better than that. I deserve someone who sees me as essential, not optimal. Someone who doesn't need to watch me shine in someone else's light before recognizing my value. She pulled her wrist free, gently but firmly. Be good to Vivian, Bastien. She seems lovely, and she deserves better than being your second choice if I take you back. We both do. Inside, Raphael was waiting near the doorway, as though he'd never really left. His eyes searched her face, and whatever he saw there made him smile. You're free, he said simply. I am. Then let's talk about your future. They spoke for another hour, and by the end of it, Geneviève had agreed to consider his offer. She needed time to think, to plan, to envision what this new version of her life might look like. Raphael understood, gave her his private number, and told her to take all the time she needed. But as she was leaving, he said something that stayed with her. Geneviève, I want you to know that my interest in you is professional. Your talent, your eye, your integrity, those are what I value. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed the rest as well. You're a remarkable woman, and whoever eventually earns your heart will be the luckiest man alive. I just want to make sure you know your worth before anyone else tries to claim it. It wasn't a declaration, but it was an acknowledgement, and it was given freely, with no expectation of return. That, Geneviève realized, was what respect looked like. That was what it felt like to be seen by someone who didn't need anything from you except the opportunity to see you shine. The next 3 months unfolded like a dream Geneviève hadn't known she was allowed to have. She accepted Raphael's offer and began building the Emerging Voices division from the ground up. She kept her bookshop but hired a manager to run the day-to-day operations, transforming it into a hub for the writers and artists she was discovering through the foundation. Raphael was a mentor, a colleague, and increasingly a friend. He taught her the business side of publishing, introduced her to everyone who mattered, and gave her complete autonomy over her decisions. He trusted her judgment in a way that felt revolutionary. But he also maintained appropriate boundaries. Their relationship was professional, warm, collaborative, and nothing more. Geneviève appreciated that more than she could express. She needed time to rebuild herself, to understand who she was outside of relationship to anyone else. Paris whispered, of course. People speculated about her connection to Raphael, about what had happened with Bastien, about whether she was climbing or had simply always been higher than anyone realized. She ignored all of it and focused on the work. The work was extraordinary. She discovered Théophile Arnaud, a Syrian refugee writing poetry that broke hearts and rebuilt them. She found Margot Bisset, whose debut novel about growing up poor in rural France was being called the most important book of the decade. She championed Adelaide Fontaine, a transgender writer whose memoir was both searing and transcendent. Each discovery felt like vindication, like proof that her instincts had always been right, that her quiet little life had been building toward something significant all along. And Bastien watched it all from the sidelines. She heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Vivian was struggling, that he'd become distracted, distant, that he spoke often about missed opportunities and roads not taken, that he'd tried to attend several literary events where Geneviève was speaking, only to be politely but firmly uninvited. She felt nothing about this. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even pity. He was simply a person she used to know, living a life she was no longer part of. But then came the evening that changed everything again. 6 months after the Belrose Gala, Geneviève was hosting a launch party for Théophile's poetry collection at her bookshop. The space was packed with writers, artists, journalists, and supporters. Raphael was there, of course, standing near the back with his characteristic low profile, letting Geneviève command the room. She was in the middle of introducing Théophile when the door opened and Bastien walked in. The room didn't fall silent. Most people didn't know their history, but Genevieve's words stuttered for just a moment before she recovered. She continued her introduction, welcomed Théophile to the microphone, and tried to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Why was he here? After the reading, as people mingled and celebrated, Bastien approached her. He looked different than he had at the gala. Thinner, tired, like success was wearing him down rather than building him up. "Geneviève," he said, "this is incredible. What you've built here, what you're doing, it's exactly what Paris needs. Thank you. I mean it. I've been following your work with the foundation. You're changing lives. That's the intention." Silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy. Finally Bastien said, "I need to tell you something. Vivian and I broke up." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" "I am. She seemed like a good person. I hope she finds someone who appreciates her." She did. She's engaged to someone from her father's company. Someone who actually shows up for her instead of being haunted by someone else. Geneviève softened slightly. "Bastien, I can't stop thinking about you," he said, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for too long. "About us, about what I threw away. I see you everywhere, Geneviève. In every success I have, in every room I walk into, I'm looking for you. I made the biggest mistake of my life that night at the chateau, and I don't know how to move forward knowing what I lost." Before Geneviève could respond, Raphael appeared at her side. Not possessively, not territorially, but present in a way that spoke volumes. "Monsieur Moreau," he said politely. "Enjoying the event. I was just congratulating Geneviève on her success." "As you should. She's remarkable." Raphael's hand rested lightly on the small of Genevieve's back, and even that simple gesture felt like coming home. "Though I suspect you're here for more than congratulations." Bastien's face hardened. "I'm here to tell Geneviève the truth. That I was wrong, that I want another chance, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "Stop," Geneviève said quietly. "Please, Bastien. Just stop." "But I love you." "No, you don't. You love the idea of me, maybe. You love that I've become someone other people value, that I'm no longer convenient to dismiss. But you don't love me. You don't even know me." "That's not true." "It is true. Because if you knew me, you'd know that what I needed most that night at the chateau wasn't for you to choose me. It was for me to choose myself. And I finally have. I've built something real, something meaningful, something mine. And I'm not going to trade it for a second chance with someone who needed to watch me walk away before realizing I was worth holding on to." Tears were streaming down Bastien's face now, and Geneviève felt a pang of something that might have been compassion. But compassion wasn't the same as obligation. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said gently. "I really do. But it's not me. It was never really me. You were in love with your own vision of the future, and I didn't fit the picture you'd painted. That's okay. We get to make new pictures. And him." Bastien gestured toward Raphael. He fits your picture. Geneviève glanced at Raphael, who was watching her with those eyes that saw everything, that had been seeing her all along. He's teaching me that I don't need someone to fit my picture. I need someone who helps me paint it. It wasn't until later that Geneviève fully understood the significance of that moment. Bastien left the party shortly after, and she didn't see him again for a long time. But the look on his face as he walked away stayed with her, not because it gave her satisfaction, but because it reminded her of who she might have become if she'd stayed. Diminished. Defined by someone else's limitations. After the last guest left, Geneviève and Raphael sat in the bookshop surrounded by empty glasses and the pleasant exhaustion of a successful evening. "You handled that with extraordinary grace," Raphael said. "I didn't feel graceful. I felt sad for him." "That's what grace is, Geneviève. Responding with compassion even when you've been hurt. Though I must say, I appreciated your comment about painting pictures." She laughed. "Was it too much?" "It was perfect." He paused, seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "I told you when we met that my interest in you was professional. That's been true for these past 6 months. But I'd be lying if I said it had stayed entirely professional." Genevieve's heart began to race. "Raphael, let me finish. I'm not Bastien. I'm not going to present you with some grand declaration or demand you make a decision right now. I know you're still finding yourself, still building the life you want. But I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to explore whether there might be more between us than professional respect and friendship. Because somewhere in these past 6 months, you've become the person I most want to talk to at the end of the day. You've become the person whose opinion I value above all others. And you've become someone I could very easily fall in love with, if I allowed myself to. Why haven't you? Because you deserve someone who waits for you to be ready. Who doesn't rush you or pressure you or try to claim you before you've fully claimed yourself. You've spent too much of your life being someone else's idea of who you should be. I won't be another person trying to shape you." Geneviève stood, moved to where he sat, and took his hands in hers. "What if I'm ready now? What if these past 6 months have shown me exactly what I want? And what's that? Someone who sees me. Not a fantasy, not a trophy, not a supporting character in their story. Someone who sees me and thinks, yes, her, exactly as she is. That's you, Raphael. That's what you've been from the beginning." He stood, and suddenly they were very close, and the air between them felt electric with possibility. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to go back to just colleagues. I'll want all of you, Geneviève. Your heart, your time, your dreams, your fears. Everything. That's what I'm offering." When he kissed her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like coming home to a place she'd been traveling toward her entire life. His hands cradled her face with a tenderness that made her throat tight, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I need you to know something," Raphael said, his forehead resting against hers. "This doesn't change our professional relationship. You're brilliant at what you do, and you've earned every success through your own merit. This," he gestured between them, "is separate. Cool. 2 whole people choosing each other, not one person rescuing another or one person completing another." "I know," Geneviève said. "That's why it works." The next 6 months were a revelation. Geneviève had thought she understood what a healthy relationship looked like, but she'd been operating from a deficit model. What it shouldn't be rather than what it could be. With Raphael, she learned what it meant to be with someone who celebrated her successes without feeling threatened, who supported her ambitions without needing to control them, who loved her for exactly who she was while still encouraging her growth. They kept their relationship private at first, not from shame but from a desire to protect something precious while it was still new. But eventually word spread because Paris is Paris and secrets are currency. The response was mixed. Some people thought it was romantic, that the publishing titan and the bookshop owner were a modern fairy tale. Others speculated about power dynamics, about whether Geneviève had earned her success or had it gifted to her. Geneviève learned to ignore both narratives. She knew her worth. She knew her accomplishments were her own. And she knew that anyone who thought Raphael could be manipulated into promoting someone untalented had fundamentally misunderstood who he was. But the person who struggled most with the news was Bastien. He'd been spiraling for months, according to mutual friends. His work was suffering. His relationships were shallow and short-lived. He'd become obsessed with what might have been, with the road not taken, with a woman he'd publicly humiliated and then privately regretted losing. And then came the night everything came to a head. It was at the annual Prix de Literature ceremony, where 3 of Genevieve's discoveries were nominated for major awards. She attended with Raphael, wearing a dress that made her feel powerful and beautiful. Her confidence no longer armor but simply the truth of who she'd become. They were seated near the front, surrounded by France's literary elite. Bastien was there too, several tables away, alone. Geneviève had heard that his father had pushed him to attend, that the Moreau family needed to maintain their cultural relevance, that Bastien's personal drama was affecting the family business. When Théophile won for Best Poetry Collection, Geneviève stood and applauded until her hands hurt, tears streaming down her face. This was why she did the work. This was what mattered. But when she sat back down, she caught Bastien's eye across the room. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, complete devastation mixed with clear understanding of what he'd lost. And then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He stood, walked across the ballroom floor while everyone was still celebrating Théophile's win, and stopped directly in front of Geneviève and Raphael's table. "Geneviève," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet room. "I need to say something publicly because I hurt you publicly and you deserve a public acknowledgement of how wrong I was." "Bastien, don't." But he was already kneeling, right there in front of everyone, his face ravaged by emotion. "I told you that night at the chateau that you weren't enough, that your quiet life, your bookshop, your lack of ambition made you unworthy of me. I was cruel and I was wrong. And I've spent every day since then understanding just how catastrophically wrong I was." The room was completely silent now. Phones were out, recording because this was the kind of moment that would be gossiped about for years. "You were never the problem, Geneviève. I was so obsessed with what the world thought of me, with building the right image and choosing the right partner and optimizing every decision, that I couldn't see what was real. And you were real. You were genuine and talented and kind. And I threw you away like you were nothing. But you were everything. You are everything. And I will regret what I did for the rest of my life." Tears were streaming down his face now, and Geneviève felt her own eyes fill. Not because she wanted him back, she didn't, not even a little, but because watching someone shatter in public was painful, even when they deserved the consequences of their actions. "I'm not asking for another chance," Bastien continued. "I know I don't deserve one. I'm just asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to know that I see you now. I see everything I was too blind to see before. And I hope you find everything you deserve with someone who's worthy of you." He stood then, looked at Raphael, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Respect from a man who'd lost to a man who'd won, not through conquest but through simply being what Bastien had never learned to be. Genuine. "Take care of her," Bastien said quietly. "She's more valuable than anything I'll ever have." Raphael stood, and for a moment Geneviève held her breath, unsure what would happen. But Raphael simply extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Bastien shook it. "She doesn't need me to take care of her," Raphael said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that defined everything he did. "She takes care of herself. I'm just fortunate enough to be allowed to stand beside her while she does." Bastien nodded, released Raphael's hand, and walked out of the ballroom. He left Paris 3 days later, took a position with his father's company in London, and Geneviève never saw him again. But that night, after the ceremony ended and the awards were distributed and the celebrations had moved to various after-parties, Raphael and Geneviève stood on yet another terrace overlooking yet another garden, and the symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. "Are you all right?" Raphael asked, his arm around her waist, solid and steady. I am, Geneviève said, and she meant it. I feel sad for him, but I don't feel responsible. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. You can have compassion for someone without carrying the weight of their choices. He's going to spend years punishing himself for what he did. Probably. But that's his journey, not yours. You've already done the hard work of forgiving him by refusing to let what he did define who you became. Geneviève leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, and marveled at how different this felt from anything she'd experienced with Bastien. This wasn't desperation or need or the frantic grasping of someone trying to prove their worth. This was peace. This was partnership. This was two complete people choosing each other every day, not because they needed to fill empty spaces, but because they wanted to build something together. I love you, she said, and it was the first time she'd said it out loud, though they'd been showing it to each other for months. Raphael turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his eyes holding hers with that intensity that still made her breath catch. I love you too. Not because you're perfect or because you complete me or any of those romantic cliches. I love you because you're you. Because you see the world in ways that make me want to see it better. Because you fight for people who have no voice. Because you're brave enough to keep growing even when it's uncomfortable. Because when I imagine my future, every good thing in it is better with you there. They kissed as fireworks exploded over the Seine, as Paris celebrated art and literature and the human capacity to create beauty from pain. And somewhere in London, Bastien Moreau sat alone in a hotel room, finally understanding the difference between wanting someone and loving them, between possession and partnership, between control and collaboration. The story could end there, with Geneviève and Raphael building their life together, with Bastien learning his lessons in exile, with justice served and growth achieved. But life is messier than stories, and the reverberations of that night at the Prix de Literature ceremony continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. 3 years later, Geneviève Laurent Belrose, she'd taken his name not because tradition demanded it but because she wanted to, stood in the same ballroom at Chateau Beaumont where Bastien had shattered her world. But this time she wasn't a guest. She was the host. The chateau had fallen on hard times after a series of scandals involving the Beaumont family. Laurent Beaumont, who'd apologized to her that night at the Belrose Gala, had reached out with a desperate proposal. Would she and Raphael consider purchasing the estate and transforming it into a permanent home for the Belrose Foundation's Emerging Voices program? It had taken 2 years of negotiations, renovations, and reimagining, but tonight was the grand opening. The same ballroom where she'd been humiliated now housed a state-of-the-art event space where writers and artists from around the world would gather, create, and launch their careers. The same gardens where she'd fled in shame now contained writing cottages where residents could work in peace. The same gates that had seemed to close behind her that terrible night now opened wide to welcome anyone with talent and ambition, regardless of their background or connections. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You look radiant, Celestine said, adjusting the train of Genevieve's gown. Like someone who conquered the world without firing a single shot. I didn't conquer anything, Geneviève protested. I just built something new. Same thing, darling. Just better marketing. The guests arrived in waves. Writers whose careers Geneviève had launched, publishers who'd learned to trust her judgment, artists who'd found their voice through her foundation. Théophile was there with his husband, having just been named one of Time magazine's most influential people. Margot had 2 bestsellers and a film adaptation in production. Adelaide was teaching at the Sorbonne and had become a leading voice for transgender rights in France. Raphael found her in the chaos as he always did, and pulled her aside for a moment of quiet. How are you feeling? Like I'm standing in the ashes of my old life watching something beautiful grow from them. That's because you are. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become their private language of love and respect. You've transformed this place from a site of your humiliation into a beacon of hope for hundreds of people. That's not just revenge, Geneviève. That's alchemy. I didn't do it for revenge. I know. That's why it's so powerful. As the evening progressed, Geneviève gave a speech about the Foundation's mission, about creating space for voices that had been marginalized or dismissed, about the transformative power of being seen and valued. She spoke about second chances and new beginnings, about how the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest achievements if we're brave enough to build on them. She didn't mention Bastien. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew the story, knew what had happened in this exact space years earlier, knew that she was standing in the crater of her own destruction, having rebuilt herself into something magnificent. But then, as she was finishing her speech, the ballroom doors opened and Bastien walked in. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. He looked older, more weathered, but also somehow more solid. Like he'd finally stopped running from himself and had made peace with what he found. Genevieve's heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She simply acknowledged his presence with a slight nod and continued her speech, because he no longer had the power to derail her. After she finished, after the applause died down, after the guests resumed their conversations and celebrations, Bastien approached her. Raphael was immediately at her side. Not possessive but present, and Geneviève loved him for understanding that she could handle this but didn't have to handle it alone. "Geneviève," Bastien said, and his voice was different than she remembered. Quieter. Humbler. "I hope it's all right that I'm here. Laurent invited me. Said you probably wouldn't mind, but if I'm wrong..." "It's fine, Bastien. This is a public event. You're welcome here. I wanted to see what you'd built, what you'd become. I've been following your work from London and it's..." He paused, struggled for words. "It's extraordinary. You're changing the literary world, Geneviève. You're giving voice to people who never had a chance before. Thank you. I also wanted to tell you that I'm engaged. To someone I met in London. Her name is Eleanor and she's a social worker. She has no connection to my family's business, no interest in my money or status. She loves me for who I am, not who I could be for her. And I'm learning slowly what that actually means." Geneviève smiled, and it was genuine. "I'm happy for you, Bastien. Truly. I don't deserve your happiness on my behalf, but I appreciate it." He looked at Raphael. "Thank you for taking care of her. For seeing what I was too blind to see." "I appreciate the sentiment," Raphael said carefully. "But as I told you years ago, she doesn't need me to take care of her. She never did. I'm just fortunate enough to be her partner while she takes care of herself and changes the world in the process." Bastien nodded, and there was no bitterness in his face, only acceptance. "I spent years being angry about what I lost. Angry at you for moving on, angry at myself for driving you away, angry at the universe for not giving me a do-over. But therapy has taught me that I didn't lose you. I never had you, not really, because I never took the time to understand who you actually were. I was in love with an idea, a placeholder, someone I could shape into what I needed. And you deserved so much better than that." "We both did," Geneviève said gently. "You deserved someone who saw you clearly too, Bastien. Someone who loved you for more than your name or your connections. I hope Eleanor is that person for you." "She is. She calls me on my nonsense, refuses to let me hide behind my family's reputation, and somehow still loves me anyway. It's terrifying and wonderful, and I finally understand why you walked away. You were looking for something real, and I was offering you a performance." They spoke for a few more minutes, and then Bastien excused himself, congratulated her once more on her success, and disappeared into the crowd. Geneviève watched him go and felt only peace. "That was surprisingly mature," Raphael observed. "People can grow if they want to badly enough. I think he finally wanted to. Do you regret anything? Any part of how it all unfolded?" Geneviève considered this carefully. "I regret the pain. I regret that humiliation in front of all those people. But I don't regret the outcome. If Bastien hadn't rejected me that night, I might have spent my whole life being a supporting character in his story. Instead, I got to write my own. And what a story it is." Later that night, after the last guest had left and the chateau was quiet, Geneviève and Raphael walked through the gardens hand in hand. The moon was full, casting silver light across the carefully tended paths, and the air smelled of roses and possibility. "I have something to tell you," Raphael said, and there was something in his voice that made Geneviève stop walking. "What is it?" "I'm stepping down as director of the foundation." Genevieve's heart seized. "What? Why? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, actually. I'm 63 years old, Geneviève. I've built what I wanted to build, launched the careers I wanted to launch. And now I want to spend my time doing something different." "What?" "I want to travel with you. I want to write the book I've been thinking about for 20 years. I want to spend my mornings reading in bed and my evenings cooking dinner together. I want to be present for all the small moments we miss when we're busy changing the world. But the foundation will thrive under your leadership. You've been running it in everything but name for 3 years now. It's time to make it official." Geneviève felt tears pricking her eyes. "You're giving me the foundation. I'm giving you what's always been yours. I just held the title while you grew into it." "Raphael, marry me," he said, and it wasn't a question, not exactly, but an invitation. "Not because I need you to, not because society expects it, but because I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth waking up next to you. Because I want to be your partner in every sense of the word. Because you've taught me that it's never too late to choose love over fear, growth over stagnation, authenticity over performance." "Yes," Geneviève said, and she was crying now. Happy tears that reflected moonlight. "Yes to all of it. To marriage, to partnership, to building a life that's ours and no one else's." They married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the chateau, surrounded by the writers and artists whose lives they'd changed and who had changed them in return. Théophile read poetry. Margot gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. Adelaide sang a song she'd written specifically for them. Bastien sent a gift, a first edition of Genevieve's favorite book, with a note that read simply, "Thank you for showing me what it looks like to choose growth over bitterness. Wishing you every happiness. B." Geneviève displayed it in the Foundation's library, not as a trophy but as a reminder that people were capable of change, that even our worst moments could lead to someone else's growth. The years that followed were full and rich and occasionally challenging because life is always challenging, regardless of how much success you achieve. The Foundation grew, expanding to include programs in music and visual arts. Geneviève became a leading voice in discussions about diversity and inclusion in publishing. She gave talks at universities and conferences around the world, sharing her story not as a fairy tale but as a case study in the power of knowing your worth. Raphael kept his promise, stepping back from daily operations but remaining involved as an advisor and mentor. He wrote his book, a memoir about building the foundation and the lessons he'd learned about talent, ambition, and the difference between success and significance. It became a bestseller naturally, and he donated all the proceeds to scholarships for emerging artists. They traveled extensively, spending months at a time in different countries, discovering new writers and new perspectives. They bought a small apartment in Rome, a cottage in Scotland, a flat in Tokyo. They collected art and books and memories, always returning to Paris and the chateau that had become the physical manifestation of Genevieve's transformation. 10 years after that night when Bastien had publicly apologized, Geneviève received a letter. It was postmarked from Bristol, England, and the return address was one she didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Bastien's distinctive script. "Dear Geneviève, I'm writing to tell you that Eleanor and I had a daughter 6 months ago. We named her Marguerite, after your grandmother, because Eleanor insisted that the strongest woman I'd ever known deserved to be honored, even if I'd been too stupid to appreciate her at the time. Our daughter will grow up knowing your story. Not as a cautionary tale about what her father did wrong, but as an inspiration about what's possible when you refuse to let someone else's limitations define you. I want her to understand that rejection isn't always about your worth. Sometimes it's about someone else's inability to see it. I've become a better person because you refused to settle for less than you deserved. You could have taken me back that night at the ceremony, or any of the dozens of times I tried to reach out in those first few years. You could have accepted my apology and given me another chance, because it would have been easier and because society tells women they should forgive and forget and give men endless opportunities to do better. But you didn't. You chose yourself instead. And in doing so, you taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or public declarations or kneeling in ballrooms. It's about showing up consistently, seeing someone clearly, and choosing them again and again, even when it's hard. Eleanor and I are happy. We have a good life, built on honesty and mutual respect. I'm a better father, a better partner, and a better person than I would have been if you'd let me off the hook. So thank you, Geneviève. Thank you for loving yourself enough to walk away. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I hope you're still changing the world, one writer at a time. With gratitude and respect, Bastien. P.S. Eleanor says to tell you that she's read everything your foundation has published, and if our daughter shows any interest in writing, we know exactly where to send her when she's old enough. Geneviève read the letter twice, then showed it to Raphael over breakfast in their Paris apartment. He read it carefully, handed it back and said, "He finally figured it out." "What's that?" "That the best thing he ever did for himself was losing you. Because it forced him to become someone worthy of someone else." "Do you think that's true? That we need to lose things to appreciate them?" "I think some people do. But you didn't. You always knew what mattered. You just needed to believe that you were allowed to have it." Geneviève folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box where she kept meaningful correspondence. She would respond, of course, congratulating Bastien and Eleanor on their daughter, wishing them well. But she wouldn't dwell on it, wouldn't let it take up more space in her mind than it deserved. Because here was the truth that she'd learned through pain and growth and the long, slow work of becoming herself. Some people come into your life to stay, and some come to teach you lessons. Some loves are meant to last forever, and some are meant to crack you open so you can become who you were always meant to be. Some rejections are the best things that ever happened to you, even if they feel like the worst in the moment. Bastien's rejection had devastated her, but it had also freed her. It had forced her to examine her own worth, to build her own empire, to discover that she didn't need someone to choose her. She needed to choose herself. And in choosing herself, she'd found Raphael. Not as a replacement or an upgrade, but as a true partner. Someone who saw her not as a project to improve or a trophy to display, but as a complete person worthy of respect and love and space to grow. That was the real story. Not that an alpha had knelt before her and made another alpha jealous. Not that rejection had led to revenge or vindication. But that a woman had learned her worth, refused to settle, and built a life so full and meaningful that the person who rejected her became a footnote rather than a defining chapter. Years later, when Geneviève was invited to give a TED Talk about her journey, she told the story carefully, thoughtfully, with respect for everyone involved. She talked about the night at the chateau, about the pain of public humiliation, about the temptation to let that moment define her. But she spent more time talking about what came after. About the decision to accept Raphael's offer. About the risk of stepping into a bigger version of herself, about the daily choice to believe she was worthy of the opportunities being offered to her. "The rejection wasn't the story," she told an audience of thousands, her voice steady and sure. "It was the prologue. The real story began when I decided that someone else's inability to see my value didn't diminish that value. When I chose to build my own life rather than wait for permission to exist in someone else's. When I understood that the most important person who needed to choose me was me." The talk went viral as these things do. It was shared millions of times, translated into dozens of languages, and used in classrooms and workshops around the world. People wrote to her thanking her for putting words to something they'd felt but couldn't articulate. Women shared their own stories of rejection and rebirth, of pain that became power, of endings that led to better beginnings. And somewhere in Bristol, a little girl named Marguerite would grow up hearing about the woman her father had lost, the woman who'd taught him what it meant to truly see someone. She would visit the chateau one day, attend one of the foundation's programs, and discover her own voice as a writer, continuing the cycle of transformation and growth that her namesake had started generations before. But that's a different story. This story ends where it began. In a ballroom with champagne and music and the kind of moment that changes everything. Except this time, Geneviève isn't the one being rejected. She's standing at a podium announcing the names of this year's Foundation Fellows, watching young writers and artists realize that someone sees them, values them, believes in their potential. She's wearing her grandmother's pearls and a dress that makes her feel powerful, and a wedding ring that represents partnership rather than possession. Her husband is in the audience, watching her with the same intense focus he's brought to everything they've built together. Her foundation has changed hundreds of lives, launched dozens of careers, and created space for voices that might otherwise have been silenced. And as she looks out at the crowd of artists and dreamers and people brave enough to believe that their stories matter, she thinks about that night when Bastien Moreau looked at her and saw nothing worth keeping. She thinks about how wrong he was. She thinks about how right everything turned out. And she smiles, because she finally understands that the best revenge isn't making someone regret losing you. It's building a life so meaningful that their rejection becomes irrelevant. It's becoming so fully yourself that you can look back at the person who couldn't see your value and feel nothing but gratitude that they freed you to find someone who could. That's the real power move. Not bitterness or vindication or showing them what they missed, but genuine, complete indifference born from genuine, complete fulfillment. That's what it looks like when you choose yourself. That's what it sounds like when you finally understand your worth. That's the sound of a woman who no longer needs anyone to kneel before her because she's learned to stand on her own. And it's the most powerful sound in the world.